is being recorded.
Is there an echo when I talk?
No, it's just when you hit the recording button that very
Okay,
first
great.
time.
I heard it come from like two speakers on my system, and I was like, okay, great.
Okay, it is time for us to get started. It's just so that way we're all on time. Welcome to today's session, Expanding Survivor Support, Embedding Gender-Based Violence Work and Confidential Advising in Cultural Center Spaces. My name is Jessica Hinault, and I will serve as the moderator for this session. As a reminder, this session will be recorded. All recordings will be available to you through the app for 3 months following the conference. As you watch this session, we ask that you please use the Whova engagement features. If you look to the right of the screen, you will see a Q&A, polls, chat, and community tabs. Please use the chat and reserve questions for the Q&A tab. All participants are muted and cannot unmute unless the presenter and/or host unmutes you. You can also select live transcription is available for live audio captioning and for the full transcript. Please also notice the Take Notes feature under the session title. You can store your notes and ideas from this session here. Your notes are only yours and will not appear on anyone else's screen. When the session is over, we ask that you please go to the conference evaluation and provide feedback on how your session went. I will put that evaluation link in the chat shortly, and we'll add it again at the end of the session. If you are applying for continuing education credits, you must complete your evaluation. I think that's it, and we are ready to begin. So Gabby, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for jumping into my session. I have the video bar across the bottom, but just want to make sure it looks to me like there's not a black bar across my slides. So that looks good, and I am going to proceed. But if that happens, let me know. Like Jessica said, my name is Gabby Schwartz. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Associate Director of Advocacy at the Women's Resources Center at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Mirroring, there we go. Mirroring one of my mentors, Dr. Jessica Sanchez, wanted to do kind of an intro slide of who I am and kind of the perspectives I'm bringing to the table. I do not usually share myself in pajama photos, but yesterday when Juliet was talking about in the intro kind of doing something to not be multitasking, I was actually addressing my holiday cards, and so you all get a sneak peek of my holiday photos. This is myself and my dog Georgie. I want to recognize that I am coming in to talk about expanding survivor support and embedding confidential advising or advocacy resources into cultural center spaces. But I am coming into this work as a white Midwesterner, proud Minnesotan girl, and recognize the privilege that comes with that, and that I am kind of continually doing the work to understand my students and their experiences. I am a first generation grad student. My mom completed college when I was in high school. So kind of first generation traditional college, but first generation in my family to have a master's. I am an active volunteer and on the board of directors of my local rape crisis center. In my free time, I like to do powerlifting. I have been doing campus advocacy for over 7 years. I started my career at a smaller university in Wisconsin where I was a team of one, and was doing both advocacy and prevention at the time. I am about 4 years into my role here in Illinois where I am doing just campus advocacy. I am a traveler. I love exploring new places. I'm a lifelong learner. This is really important for me. I am really invested into anti-oppressive advocacy work. If you haven't engaged with Wanda Swan and her organization, Start by Talking, I would highly recommend it. I am a proud dog mom, as I mentioned. I am a firstborn, only daughter, sister, and what I refer to as a non-biological auntie. I've got a lot of really sweet nibblings from some really great friends in my life. So knowing kind of that context and how I am coming into the work that I do, Some of the objectives today are to talk about and understand the importance of decentering whiteness in advocacy services, and to identify some of the unique considerations for service provisions as it relates to marginalized communities on our campuses. And Tess, I was at UW Oshkosh actually for a couple years. I think my position has since been eliminated due to funding, which is a conversation for another time. We're also going to explore strategies for empowering survivors and advocating for systemic change within your cultural centers and your university. And then at the end, I have an action plan for us to think about how do we continue to foster safe and supportive spaces for discussions around gender-based violence on campus. I do not have many, I don't have polls or audio to share. That was a little too techy for me this time around, but do have a handful of kind of discussion questions, and I'm hoping that we can engage in the chat for those. So a brief kind of overview of my agenda. I'm going to talk about understanding gender-based violence, recognizing that we are all at a campus advocacy and prevention conference, and so this will be the briefest overview possible, knowing that we all probably have an understanding of gender-based violence. I want to spend some time talking about decentering whiteness in advocacy. I'm going to dive into the history of the embedded confidential advisor model that we have here at Illinois, and specifically some of the assessment and the reflection that I have done and that my team has done, and then going into kind of what our personal next steps are here, and then we'll talk about considerations for what that might look like to have an embedded model on your campus. So to start with understanding gender-based violence, I pulled the definition from the United Nations of Women, knowing that gender-based violence includes any harmful act, physical, sexual, or emotional, perpetrated against a person's will that is based on socially ascribed gender differences between males and females, or based on gender identity. And we know that this can take many forms of domestic violence, sexual exploitation, trafficking, child or early marriage. I think we use gender-based violence as a very umbrella term, but you might hear me use a little bit more sexual violence or sexual misconduct as the umbrella term, as that is the terminology that my university uses, and that tends to be what I see happening more on campuses. So really looking at specifically sexual violence. So my first kind of question for us today is how we think or how we see gender-based violence or sexual violence showing up in different communities on our campuses. If you have thoughts, please feel free to go ahead and drop them in the chat. I see normalizing violence against women and limiting resources to them. Absolutely. Ooh, thank you, Alexandra. Latina students being hesitant to engage with university resources and attempting to manage harm within their own spaces. That's a great one, and I'm actually going to talk a lot about how we have seen that show up on our campus. Greek life exclusion, concerns around justice system and legal issues. I think we definitely see different communities engaging with different resources in different ways or at different levels. International students weaponizing culture to excuse harm caused by stalking or IPV, absolutely. Okay, thank you so much for your engagement in that. I appreciate that. And Cassandra said we work a lot with international students, which requires understanding of visas and the impacts. I love that. We have talked a lot about how that concerns around visas has come up more recently in our conversations with students. And I think a lot of that has to do with our concerns around deportation and student visas and the processes with Title IX for sure. Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay. I want to move on to the history of the anti-violence movement, with the caveat that I am not delving into the entire history of the anti-violence movement, because that would be an entire presentation on its own. I want to recognize that the history that we are often told is that is told by the victors, the ones that have done kind of the conquering, and we are hearing the convenient truths, and a lot of times that history ignores the suffering and the harm and the efforts of communities of color who were really at the heart of this work. So I want to recognize that we know that women of color have been doing this work and really are at the heart of the anti-violence movement long before the 1960s or 1970s, which I think is when a lot of the kind of history of the movement picks up in that kind of second wave feminism area. We know that sexual violence is intrinsically linked with racial violence. And we know that Black women founded the very systems that we use today when we think about emergency housing, public speak outs, accessing safety. I think it is impossible for us to talk about sexual violence without acknowledging the realism of racial violence. And it's really important to elevate and reflect on the history of this movement and the accurate history of the movement, and how that history has since been whitewashed by systems of privilege and oppression. And I recognize that this is a 3 bullet point list on the history of the movement. I am not going into kind of those larger events, but really want us to focus on that the history in this movement was truly started by communities of color, and that it is very important for us to reflect on that and to honor that. And I think we know that the anti-violence field has since been kind of co-opted by white individuals. And so I want us to take a second to kind of reflect on how we have seen whiteness show up in the anti-violence field and what that has looked like, because it is really our job as advocates and anti-violence professionals to think about and address our roles, and then the role that power and privilege has in our organization and the institutional systems that we're a part of. So if you have thoughts on this, please feel free to use the chat. I see that Alexandra, thank you. Our anti-violence system in itself tends to lean towards criminal or legal involvement and solutions regarding those systems rather than prioritizing client needs. Absolutely. Healing interventions that lack cultural practices. That whiteness is the foundation of the anti-violence field. Our biases and over punitive responses of minority groups like men of color. Awesome. Thank you so much for putting some thoughts in the chat. I think I see all of these on my campus, in our campus community. And like I said, I think as advocates, it's really our job to think about how that is showing up in the work that we're doing, what our role is in that. I really like Emily's answer as well. So expecting survivors to go straight to the legal system for protection, although minority groups may have had negative experiences with the legal system and law enforcement. Absolutely. So I bring this piece up because our embedded model at the University of Illinois is something that is one of our one of our practices to think about how whiteness is showing up in the field for us, and how can we kind of counter the roles of power and privilege in our institutional system. And so our embedded model has been a way for us to address how this shows up. And just elevating the importance of decentering whiteness in advocacy. We know that students of color, LGBTQIA plus students, and students living with disabilities are harmed by sexual violence at a significantly higher rate than those in dominant identity groups. I attended a breakout session earlier today. I think it was Amy who was the facilitator, and really talked a lot about some of the inequities for survivors in the system. And I just really resonated with that kind of leading into my presentation. We also know that compounding experiences of interrelated forms of oppression, so thinking about the intersections of racial violence and sexual violence, complicate and deepen the trauma that is experienced by survivors with marginalized identities when they're seeking services. I think about this a lot when we think about state-sanctioned violence, and the rise in that we are seeing right now, and thinking about how can we decenter whiteness in our work, but really prioritizing the individual needs of all of our students. Recognizing that advocacy is something that is not a one-size-fits-all. Every survivor's needs are going to be unique, and so this is a really big question that I have, and thinking about advocacy within a specific community. So choosing a community that you work with, choosing a community that maybe your services aren't quite reaching fully. What might be some, and this kind of popped up in the chats as we talked about different systems that students might engage in, but what are some unique considerations for services and providing advocacy to a specific community? I think one of our previous answers about Latina students being hesitant to engage in community resources and working to manage harm within their own spaces is a really great example of thinking about a very specific consideration for one community. Oh, thank you, Samara. Non-traditional help seeking, absolutely. I think one that we have seen on our campus predominantly is at our Latinx Cultural House, that our students are trying to mitigate harm within their own environments. They're going to staff that they know at that center rather than seeking resources outside of the staff in their spaces. Language access, just because someone is at a university in the US doesn't mean they best communicate harm in English, and that can be really confusing for sure. We don't have currently really great translation services, but we have encountered that with students where it's really hard to articulate the harm that has happened to them in a language that is not their first language. Culturally responsive healing and inclusive hiring practices for advocacy centers, absolutely. Alternative reporting and accountability options. I think those tend to be really limited in university systemic spaces. For survivors of domestic violence, it can be difficult for people who are transgender or part of the LGBTQ plus community to find safe and inclusive shelter if that's what they want. Overcoming the shame and silence barriers that an individual's culture may reinforce. Awesome. Thank you so much. We've seen that specifically thinking about how students are accessing mental health resources and talking about whether or not that is stigmatized in their culture and if it feels safe for them to access those services. So I realized that it kind of started us with some pretty big questions, and the goal is to really just get us thinking about what does culturally responsive work really look like. Thinking about some of the communities that you work with on campus, and maybe thinking about those that your advocacy services are not reaching and what might be some potential solutions there. Andrew, physical accessibility, absolutely. Is there a ramp, and how far is the office from other services or accessible parking? At the University of Illinois, you have to pay for parking in every single spot possible. And I would say that is absolutely inaccessible for students trying to get to different spaces on campus. So wonderful. Thank you so much. I realized that I started talking about confidential advising and didn't actually explain that. So I just want to give like a really brief overview of what that means. The state of Illinois uses the term confidential advising for what is really referred to as our campus advocates or our victim advocates. We are deemed confidential by a state law, the Preventing Sexual Violence in Higher Education Act. And this law dictates the training that myself and my staff have, our duties, our responsibilities, things like that. This is a typical slide that we would provide to our campus community, talking about what do our confidential advisors actually do. And so I just wanted to provide an intro to this so that you all are kind of aware of what context of support I'm thinking in when I talk about what our embedded model looks like. So for us, confidential advising involves support, crisis intervention, and case management. We are located at the Women's Resources Center, but we serve students of all gender identities. My staff is made up of 3 full-time advocates. Our center staff is a total of 8 individuals. 4 of those individuals are trained to be confidential advisors, but that is not the primary responsibility of their role. And so that is really, they are not seeing clients on a day-to-day basis. They are not actively taking on new cases. They are really meant to be kind of, I call them tertiary. They are a backup confidential advisor. That is, if all of a sudden the entire advocacy team is on vacation, or as has happened in the history of our organization post-COVID, everyone left at the same time. And there was a lot of turnover at one time, and we didn't have confidential staff. And so we have kind of instituted this staff training model so that we would have someone should that ever happen. But when I say we do crisis intervention, I tell our students, because we are 3 people, we are not a 24/7 center. We are Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. We do advocacy within student disciplinary and or legal systems. I will say the primary piece that we work with is our student disciplinary system. We have some really great community organizations that we connect with and collaborate with in order to do help students through the legal system. Our team of advocates do not have any licensed counseling or social work training, so we provide a lot of referrals to other support systems or networks, really helping students get connected with mental health resources, medical health resources, things like that. We walk students through their rights, their options, and various resources. We'll help students think about what advocacy and what support they need for their academic, housing, or workplace support. Specifically, workplace is limited to on-campus. So we work with our Title IX office, who is the office that facilitates our supportive measures. But we'll help students think about what that support might look like. We do not have the ability to implement supportive measures, so our students do have to go through Title IX, and we'll help them go through that process. That involves specifically if students don't want to report to the university, but they still want to access supportive measures, we'll help students navigate that in a way that involves sharing the least amount of their experience as possible, based on what their priorities are and what their desire is. And then we're also available to do advocacy or support for safe partners, friends, or family, with the caveat that we will never acknowledge that we have or have not met with a student. But if a friend is coming in because they're not sure how to support their roommate or their sibling who has experienced harm, we can kind of talk through what that best support looks like. So this is what me and my staff do. This is what confidential advising or advocacy services at Illinois look like. I wanted to give a foundation of what our embedded model is. This is a program that has been designed to address barriers that marginalized communities experience on campus. This is a space where we really utilize a student-centered and a survivor-centered approach to meet survivors where they are at. As I mentioned before, we are continuing to work on decentering whiteness through our practices. And this model really creates an opportunity for emerging community-specific sexual misconduct prevention and response students, their response services. When we think about using this student-centered, survivor-centered approach, we are looking at really intentionally meeting students where they are. So our embedded model involves physically going to different spaces, and specifically spaces where our students already feel safe. And we are there to build community and build connections with them. And we're really intentional about that. And making sure that we are thinking about how are we implementing practices, resources, programs that are tailored to our students' specific experiences. I do want to add the caveat that this program or this model is one that I inherited. So I mentioned that I have been at Illinois for almost 4 years now. The work for this program started in 2017. And this was a collaboration between the former director of the Women's Resources Center and the former director of La Casa Cultural Latino, which is our Latinx cultural house on campus. So in 2017, Sarah Colome, who is the former WRC director, and at the end of my presentation, I have her chapter that really outlines this program's foundations to share with you all. But in 2017, that's when Sarah and Mariana, who was the then director of La Casa, started meeting to talk about programs, services, and have focus groups to think about what does this look like? What are some gaps in our services? The summer of 2019 is really when these embedded model conversations started to happen. What would it look like to provide services in embedded spaces, not just at the WRC? The focus groups had really brought up that students had a lack of awareness of where the WRC was. There was a perceived lack of accessibility. Naturally, you might notice by our name, WRC, I mentioned that we do serve students of all gender identities, but walking into a space titled the Women's Resources Center, not identifying as a woman, can be really intimidating and uncomfortable for students. In December of 2019, the WRC hired their first embedded confidential advisor. That is what CA stands for. And this staff member was embedded originally at La Casa. There had been conversations starting with another cultural house on campus, but this was our first hired confidential advisor who was meant to be embedded. As we know, in March of 2020, the global pandemic happened and all services moved to being virtual. In June of 2020, the WRC hired their second embedded confidential advisor. This person was intended to be embedded at BNAC, which is our, stands for the Bruce D. Nesbitt African American Cultural Center on campus. In the fall of 2021, that's when our in-person services actually resumed. So this whole 2020 time, when we had our second confidential advisor, they were doing virtual embedded services, which, as you can imagine, looks very different than actually being embedded in person. In the fall of 2021, there was a short period where we still had two confidential advisors, but we eventually had one staff member move on. So then we had one confidential advisor going between BNAC and La Casa and trying to be embedded in both spaces. In the fall of 2022, that is when myself and two of our confidential advisors were hired, so we were considered fully staffed, and our embedded model resumed in the way that it was originally intended to. So just wanted to give you a brief history of this model and kind of where we are at. Since the fall of 2022, we have had 2 confidential advisors join our staff and then move on to new career paths. And so we have 1 confidential advisor who has been with us since the fall of 2022, and then in October we had our newest staff member start, and so she will eventually kind of be embedded as well. I wanted to highlight some of the initial considerations that came up in those focus groups, but just also give a little bit of context. So on the far left of the screen, you'll see the Women's Resources Center. This is the inside of our office. I did not do an outside photo because we're in a really not cute leased building, but the inside of our center is great. Our office is located on Green Street, which is kind of a central hub on campus. It's a street with a lot of apartment buildings and a lot of restaurants, so it's one that is frequented by students, but again, I mentioned we're in a leased building, so the entrance is a little weird. It's not very friendly on the first floor, but then you have to make your way to the second floor. And then we are a 10-minute walk from Nevada Street on campus. Nevada Street is home to many of our cultural resource centers. So in the top right, you'll see a photo of La Casa, and in the bottom right, you'll see a photo of BNAC. These spaces are roughly a 10 to 15-minute walk from our office, which makes a difference for students. So one, it's where all of our cultural resource centers are located, but it also is a different physical proximity to areas of campus than the Women's Resources Center is. Some of the additional identified barriers that came up was, again, the perceived gender barrier. Our staff has historically been predominantly women identified. I believe actually all of our advocates have been women or non-binary identified, but female presenting. The location on campus, again, we are about 10 to 15 minutes of a walk. And parking in both of those spaces is not actually accessible or very plentiful. A lack of representation and culturally competent programming and services. There has absolutely been a historical perception of an all-white staff. We do have a predominantly white staff, and I think that is something that students see and can show up in programming. And so thinking about how can our programs be more culturally competent, culturally responsive, how are we serving our students? And then the accessibility of confidential advisors. Again, that it can be hard to walk into a space that is labeled a Women's Resources Center and you don't identify as a woman, and not being sure if someone's going to be available right away or not. And so really the embedded model started in efforts to address some of these identified barriers. So with all of that history, what does our embedded model look like in practice? When I started at Illinois, it was kind of our understanding that the embedded model was created with the idea that there would be one confidential advisor specific to each embedded location, and they would be there 2 days a week. This was something that I'm going to talk a little bit more about, kind of impacts and challenges with that. But that was really kind of how we inherited. This was how the model was intended to be. So we went in, my staff and I, saying, okay, we're going to be at BNAC 2 days a week. We're going to be at La Casa 2 days a week. Our confidential advisors are intended to invest in relationships with students and staff while they're there. This is not a program where they are meant to just be sitting in an office on their computer all day, but really thinking about engaging with students and staff in those spaces to really strengthen those relationships. Our staff should be actively seeking out organic opportunities for collaboration. So this looks like attending or participating in student staff meetings, student org programs, regular programs that are happening, and then supporting the needs of the host center's programs. So Lunch on Us is a program series at Illinois where each cultural resource center hosts a lunch in their space one day a week. So the WRC hosts on Mondays. Other cultural centers host on different days of the week. And so that is a big program that brings in a lot of students to our cultural center spaces. And it is expected that that our staff is present for those programs, whether that's helping serve lunch, making announcements, introducing a speaker. Both BNEC and La Casa have historically had congratulatory or specific graduation ceremonies for their students, and so our staff do participate in those. Both centers have a really great orientation, pre-campus program, and welcome week events, and so really investing in kind of the big programs of those spaces. I do think it's important to highlight that our embedded confidential advisor is intended to be a campus partner. They are not operating as an additional staff member of that center. And we have been operating in this manner for the last 2.5, 3 years now. Thinking about the impacts, what has this program actually done? What are the results that we've seen? We've seen an increase in student understanding of the confidential advisor role. So students know what we do, why they might seek services from us. This has encouraged and increased student-staff collaboration. We see a lot of requests for outreach presentation from the student orgs that are involved in our cultural centers, asking for the confidential advisor who is embedded in their space to come and present to their organization. We've had an increase in students wanting to learn more about sex and gender-based violence and have those conversations, whether that is formal through workshops or specific kind of curated conversations, or just really casual and in the space. And we've also seen an increase in student awareness of sexual misconduct resources on campus. So really we're seeing kind of that increased engagement, increased knowledge, and awareness. I want to talk a little bit about how we're actually assessing this. We do semester feedback sessions with our partner staff. This has looked different every semester. Typically it involves staff meeting with professional staff. We are working on increasing our connections with our student staff to actually get feedback from our students as well. When I inherited this program, there wasn't necessarily a curated assessment strategy. So this has been something that myself and my staff have worked to establish because we really want to see, is this program working the way that it was intended to, and what are the benefits of it. In the last, I believe it's been about a year, I created what I call our embedded CA log. This is a simple form that I have my embedded staff fill out after every time that they are embedded. I have worked to make it really short so that it is not tedious. I have worked to make the questions broad so that it's not micromanaging, because I don't want my staff to feel like they have to say, this is exactly what I did today and Gabby wants to know exactly what I've been doing. But this is really to gather, what are we doing in these spaces and how are students interacting with our embedded staff. So some of the questions on this embedded log are, what did you do while you're embedded today? Top answers, top responses is staff are talking to student staff. They might be on their computer working in answering emails in spaces with other students. So both of our cultural centers have big open conference rooms or kind of social spaces, and staff might just hang out at a table there and be on their computer with a sign that says, hey, this is who I am, you can talk to me about this, and they'll interact with students as they come into the space. But they might be on their computer doing some things, or attending a program that was hosted by the embedded location, whether that is something specific from the center, or if it's student orgs tabling or doing a fundraiser in the space, they're engaging in those programs. We ask, how many total interactions did you have? So this is really looking at roughly how many people did you talk to today. We've been doing this I guess it's been about a year. So our data from spring of 2025 said an average of 5.9, or rounding up, an average of 6 individuals. And on average this semester so far, staff are talking to about 9 people. And this is really a large number, or kind of an overview of, could be about anything. I'm not asking for specific conversations or anything like that, but thinking about how many people did you actually engage with today? And then a follow-up question is really how many of your interactions were specific to confidential advising? And this could be someone wanted a confidential advising appointment and I had a full confidential meeting with them, or someone asked about the services, I told them about what we do, things like that. But how many conversations were specific to confidential advising? Last semester we saw an average of 1. This semester we're seeing closer to 2.5. Part of that could be contributed to the changes that we've made, in that we have new staff in our centers. So students are asking our new staff, what do you do? Tell me about your role. Or new staff are being more intentional in introducing themselves because they are new to that space. Some of the continued challenges, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this, and I'm happy to kind of answer questions about this or dive into it a little bit more in depth. We have not seen a documented increase in service utilization by our Black or Latinx students. I was able to pull our demographic information for the last few fiscal years. And so we have seen our service utilization by our Black African American students actually decrease over the last 2 fiscal years. And then by our Hispanic students, we have seen it kind of went down in the fiscal year 24, but it is increased so far this year. I do want to provide a caveat that the demographic information that I am looking at and that I have access to, we're able to run based off of our student IDs. And so race and ethnicity are categorized how they are in our student data system. This is not self-identified race ethnicity, but really what our system allows students to select when they create their student profile at Illinois. We have seen an increased awareness of services, but we've seen actually a lack of service utilization physically in those embedded spaces. And so when I first started, my understanding of the model was we're in embedded spaces. We are there to provide confidential advising. Students will utilize confidential advising there. We have not actually seen students doing that in terms of actually having a confidential appointment in those spaces. We saw maybe on average our first year, so in fall of 2022, I think we had a total of like 3 to 5 appointments in our embedded spaces. And I want to articulate that we are not scheduling students for appointments in those spaces unless they ask for that. That was a big request by professional staff of those spaces, was that we were allowing our embedded staff to really be connected and invested while they are in that space. So I am not in my office in the WRC scheduling students to show up at BNAC or La Casa just because a staff member is there. If a student asks to be scheduled there, we absolutely will do that. But we are not intentionally scheduling folks there based off of what our staff has requested. We are seeing that it is a challenge to understand the difference between responsible employees and confidential advisors, specifically because our students at our cultural centers are really connected and have super strong communities there. So they feel really safe and comfortable going to the professional staff at La Casa and talking to them about their concerns. And the professional staff at La Casa are not confidential. They are responsible employees. They have to report to the university. And so that is something that we're continually working towards, is saying like, oh, is this something that you should talk to a La Casa staff about, or should you talk to a WRC staff member about it? We've seen a staffing strain on the WRC physically in our location. I mentioned previously that our staff are embedded 2 days a week. The first semester we did this, we had one day, so we had our staff at BNAC on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and our staff at La Casa on Wednesdays and Thursdays. So Wednesday, I was the only confidential staff member in our office. And then 2 days of the week, there were only two of us. And when we're not seeing students utilizing service in embedded spaces, but rather they're coming to the WRC saying, I heard about services at La Casa, but I want to meet with someone at the WRC. And then we have fewer staff here to be able to meet the demand for appointments. It's been difficult to measure the impact and effectiveness. I talked a little bit about our assessment strategy, but we don't necessarily have, we're continuing to increase like our assessment of our services, but we're, due to how our tracking works, like we're not able to say, you specifically heard about us from La Casa, so how has that impacted you, that we had a confidential advisor there? And so that has just been a challenge to reframe for us as a staff, what is the goal of this program? Because again, when I inherited this model, I really thought that the goal, it was my understanding that the goal was that services would be utilized at the embedded locations. We've had to shift that to say that might not be what the goal was. And so we're not seeing that same impact, but rather the goal might be more, are students aware of services, and are we seeing actually that increase in students from different populations utilizing our services regardless of the location? We also have unique challenges in each space and community. So when my staff started in the fall of 2020, our staff member who was embedded at BNAC shared that community identity. Our staff member embedded at La Casa did not. And that was a challenge too, because again, when you think about, well, if the goal of embedded is to increase culturally responsive services, to meet students where they are, if a staff member is coming and not sharing that identity, that's a challenge in and of itself. And so we have navigated that. We have navigated staff turnover and having to rebuild those relationships. And oops, I didn't mean to do that. I'm so sorry. And also navigating moving staff to different centers. And so now we have a new staff member getting to know more staff in different cultural centers. I saw a couple questions come in. So I want to take a little bit of time to address them because it looks like I think some of them are related to some of these challenges. So I see a great question from Mallory that you have said that you have increased confidential conversations in the embedded positions, but what do those conversations look like since they're not in a confidential space? Great question. Oftentimes those might look like just talking to a student about what our services are. That is something that we count in that number is, did you say, this is what a confidential advisor does, this is how you can make an appointment with us. But it is also a requirement of our embedded spaces for this partnership that we have access to a confidential office. So both of our spaces have a room that is available for our staff to use during that time. So if a student does come in and say, I want to talk to you about my experience, we're able to say, okay, let's go up to the conference room or to this office, and we're able to actually shut the door. So we do ask that spaces who have requested that we be embedded, that we have access to a confidential space, and then we've provided a sound machine to also be able to have there so that students can have that ability to have a fully confidential conversation. And I think we're also honoring students' desire to, do I want to move, or am I comfortable talking in this space, and explaining that, like, if we're in this public space, it's not a confidential conversation, right? But if this is where you want to talk about this, like, we can do that. I see a question: if accessibility is minimized as a barrier, but we are not seeing significant increase in utilizations, what other methods would you be interested to explore in connecting with these students? So collaborative programming, presence, participation, and culturally appropriate important events. I would say those are both great examples of efforts that we do currently have. We usually each semester, if not at least the beginning of the year, our staff goes to the student staff meeting of that cultural center to introduce ourselves, talk about confidential advising, because our staff at our cultural center might have new staff who actually aren't familiar with the WRC and what we do. We also try to do the same thing for our each of our cultural centers has a coalition, I guess, or affiliated student orgs. That's the word we use. Has a coalition of affiliated student orgs. So La Casa has El Caso, which is the group of student orgs that focus on Latinx awareness, identities, and cultural. So we'll meet with El Caso at one of their kind of start of the year meetings where all of the presidents from those student orgs are, and we'll introduce our services. Participating in culturally important events. Our new staff member attended Dia de los Muertos, which was a big event for La Casa. That is a space where we are continually trying to show up at those events to increase that connection. And so really, and something else that we receive feedback for is that we've had some staff who are spending more time in the confidential space that is allotted, right? Like there's an office in each of our cultural centers for us, and if staff are spending more time there rather than in the main lounge interacting with students, that is creating some of that barrier. And so when I mentioned feedback sessions with professional staff, we have done it with the embedded staff, the person who is actually working at La Casa, but we've also done it myself and the director of the center to say, what is your feedback? Are there things that I as a supervisor need to address with my staff? So thank you for that question. And please let me know if I didn't answer that. I mentioned inheriting this model, but do I have any idea if there was resistance from your institution when this model was proposed? If so, how was the proposal justified? I don't know about the resistance from the institution as a whole. I don't want to say that there wasn't any. I do think the chapter that I will share at the end by Sarah Colomé really addresses that process and really actually talks through the process that she used to write this proposal. So I think that resource will really answer that question. I will add that my office is not the only office on our campus that has embedded services. So our counseling center has embedded counselors, not necessarily in cultural houses or spaces, but our counselors are embedded in our different colleges on campus. And then our Jeffrey Center, which works with our first-gen students in our TRIO programs, they provide embedded services at cultural resource centers and in some academic colleges as well. So I don't know the timeline of those programs, but I do know that embedded was not like a new concept when this program started. It is something that other offices have been doing. Oh, it says disconnected. Did I disconnect?
No, you're still good on my end, Gabby.
Okay, great. Huva just did a weird thing and was like, "You've disappeared," and I was like, "Oh, okay, awesome, still here." So thinking about what our next steps here are at Illinois, we are looking at how do we reassess and define the goals and the outcomes of this program. We spent a lot of time this summer, my confidential advising staff, but really also our entire WRC staff, thinking about what are the goals of our embedded program, what do we want this to be, and how do we actually measure those. We have been working with our student affairs assessment team. That is a benefit of being at a larger university, I will say, is that we have a fantastic director of assessment specifically for student affairs, who is looking at doing a campus-wide embedded programs assessment. So some of the other offices that have embedded services, what does that look like? That involves trying to start some focus groups, surveys, passive knowledge checks. We've talked about, do we just have like a question on the whiteboard in the spaces every week saying like, did you talk to or did you see this person this week? What do you think a confidential advisor does? Things like that. And then we're continuing to consider our capacity and requests for expansion. This year we did our first expansion, which was super exciting. Our Asian American Cultural Center asked us to bring embedded services to their space. So this year we did that. And I will say, due to the number of requests for expansion, and as a way to address the staffing limitations and the ability to meet appointment requests at the WRC, we have currently shifted our practice to be not necessarily embedded 2 full days a week within each center. This semester, as we have been onboarding a new staff member and we're really only operating with 2 confidential advisors, we are doing just 1 day at each center. That seems to be working pretty well. So I'm not entirely sure. My team hasn't sat down to talk about, is that what we want to do moving into next semester? And again, we really work with our embedded spaces to think about what they want those hours to look like. Something that I learned this year was to be a little bit more direct in saying, how can we show up in your space? Our staff at La Casa was significantly understaffed this year. And I was doing a lot to try to respect the staff member's capacity and not overwhelm her, but really try to say what would be helpful. How can we show up for you? And then about a month into the semester, received feedback from our staff in the WRC that with the rise of the state-sanctioned violence that the Latinx community is experiencing, it really feels as if our staff really abandoned La Casa. And so our staff was able to work together to say, how do we shift our schedules to make it work? And for me to reach out and say, we should have been here sooner. This is what our staff has capacity. This is when we're available. Does that work for you? Rather than trying to kind of set up a meeting and for me shifting kind of my communication to balance, like I don't want to intrude on your space because that is not the goal of embedded. And it is really important for us that we are there for your students and your space. And so continuing to kind of navigate those challenges and to be present for our students. So those are our next steps. I am going to kind of shift our last 15, 17 minutes to what does creating an embedded model look like for your campuses. I think some macro considerations to think about are relationship building and education. So thinking about the relationships, what partnerships do you currently have or do you desire to have? I think also looking at what populations are missing from your service provision. So for us, we were seeing, I don't actually have demographics from before I started here, but we know that our office had a lower engagement from our international student population and our Asian population. So that was a reason why it was really important for us to think about how could we bring embedded services to our Asian American Cultural Center. Thinking about, are these partnerships authentic, power conscious, and collaborative? That is really the foundation of the embedded model, is that it is collaborative, and we are not looking at just showing up in a space, but how does a space want us to show up? What is collaborative to them, right? We never want the embedded model to be extra labor for another office. But then also thinking about, what does investment in each other's work look like? And I think that kind of carries over to education, and what education do you and your team need to have? So for us, it's really important to understand the work that our embedded spaces are doing, but also understanding and making sure that we are staying aware of what are the current challenges, whether that is on campus, larger socio-political challenges, what is happening in the communities that we're serving that we need to be aware of, and how can we shift how we're bringing services to them. And then thinking about how we have a foundation for shared work. So really looking at what is the mission of the center that we're looking at being embedded in, and how is that interconnected and interdependent to our mission at the WRC. And then some of the kind of smaller micro logistical considerations is the physical space. So I mentioned that it is a requirement for us to agree to be embedded somewhere that we have access to a private room for confidential discussions. If someone comes in and says, I really want to talk to someone, we need to be able to say, yes, we can go to this space and we can have that conversation. Even though that is not something that we are predominantly seeing happen at our embedded spaces, the ability to do so is a priority for us. Trainings at embedded locations. So I have worked with our professional staff to establish what are your expectations. And that looks different at each center, right? So we have some centers who say, oh, if I have a concern, I might bring it directly to the person who's embedded, or, oh, I might actually come to you with that concern and ask you to address it. So for me, that looks like figuring out what is the expectation of professional staff in terms of how they might address feedback, but also what are expectations in events and how my staff are showing up. So we have a list of, these are the events where it is expected that we make time for a member of our team to be at, and really outlining those at the beginning of the year. We also do meet and greets with student staff. So I mentioned attending student staff meetings, at least one at the beginning of each semester. One that has been really successful is one of my confidential advisors went out of her way to schedule individual meet and greets with each of the student staff. And that might have been just an individual one-on-one chat in the space, going out for lunch or coffee. But that really bridged the connection for students to feel like we really know this staff member and we really trust them. Collaborations. We've done outreach at our early arrival programs. So BNAC and La Casa have their individual, but also have a collaborative pre-arrival, pre-orientation program for students. And we show up and we table at those events. We do training with our students there. We've connected with their affiliated student orgs. And then we offer it as an option to invite the confidential advisor who is embedded in that space to show up to events that might be triggering. So a few semesters ago, students at La Casa started hosting a program called Entre Hermanas, which was meant to be kind of a support space for our students and provide some healing. It wasn't necessarily focused specifically on sexual violence, but again, knowing that racial violence and sexual violence are so deeply interconnected, that was a program where they asked, are we able to have a confidential advisor be in the space, in the building, for that program? And that was something that the confidential advisor didn't share that identity. And so she wasn't necessarily sitting in on the conversation and attending the event, but would do kind of a, hi, here's who I am, and I'm going to be over here if someone, like in this other space, if someone needs to talk. And so providing that opportunity for collaboration. Okay, so I have a little bit of, this is kind of where we get to the action plan. I, on this screen, have provided a screenshot of the first half of my action plan. If you would like to, on your phone, you should be able to scan the QR code. You should also be able to go to go.illinois.edu/embedded action plan. This is a Canva created PDF. To be able to actually download this to kind of start thinking and reflecting. This is something that one of our confidential advisors helped create to think about what are some important considerations as we think about creating an embedded model in your space. So thinking about what structures. It did the thing again where it disconnected me on Hoovo, and it keeps telling me that I'm being recorded. But I will trust that you will interrupt me if all of a sudden I disappear. So, please let me know in the chat if a link doesn't work. I didn't explore it too much, but I believe I might have the ability to add a PDF somewhere or can share that resource if that link is not working. But some of these questions to think about are what structures need to be in place for staff to understand and support this initiative. Again, thinking about what is the goal of embedded for you and your university. For us, one of the structures was knowing like a supervision structure, right? Where all of a sudden a staff member is 2 days a week at a different center. Are they supposed to be reporting to somebody at that center? What does that look like? What is the foundation and the education need to be for a staff to be embedded? Thinking about how do we create intentional partnership without falling into traditional visitation mode. So really thinking about, thank you, Jessica, for posting that link. I appreciate it. When we say traditional visitation of embedded, like we don't want our staff to just be showing up, sitting there and being like, I'm here. This is really intentional about relationships and connection. So what are those steps for your staff to be able to do that? And how do we courageously step into a partnership of growth rather than perfectionism? This is something that is a continual work in progress for me. I know that it is how my oldest daughter, my Virgo, and honestly how whiteness shows up for me is that I want everything to work perfectly and I want it to just be excelling at all times. And so for me, it is stepping back to say, well, is it excelling? And are my expectations different than what the actual goal is? Am I projecting expectations that aren't realistic on this program? And what does that growth look like for me? And then the second half of that action plan looks like how are we navigating power, privilege, and space? Again, specifically a consideration for if the confidential advisor, the staff member who is going to be embedded, doesn't share the identity of that hosting cultural center. And then providing space for you to think about timeframes and action steps. I wanted to share these two readings as well. You should be able to Google just the phrases. Again, the QR codes work. I will work with Puzzles volunteers and staff to see if there's a spot that I can post these links kind of under my session information. Meet Them in the Center is the chapter that was written by Sarah Colomé, the former director of the WRC. And this is the chapter that really outlines how this model came to be. Is a great resource if you are looking at building this model and bringing it to your campus and your university. And then, of course, Kimberly Crenshaw, Mapping the Margins. This is a foundational reading for all of our new staff. looking at the intersectionality, identity politics, and violence against women of color. This is something that is required for anybody who joins our staff to read. We'll talk about it. But really, this is a piece that is really just a foundational framework in the work that we're doing. Some of the references that I pulled from, again, this is just like longer citations, but want to acknowledge the spaces that influence some of the work that I shared. I want to share my contact information, and then want to use the last couple minutes to answer questions. I'm going to go back to the Q&A tab and see what is left, but I am open to answering other questions. Let's see. I know a question that came before the session was, how are we navigating the political landscape following the February 2025 Dear Colleague letter? I will say that this program has not yet come into question post that Dear Colleague letter. And I think for a couple reasons. This is not, so our counseling center was asked to, I believe it was our counseling center, change some of their group therapy spaces that identified specific communities. Our embedded model is strictly called embedded confidential advising. We just happen to be embedded in cultural spaces. Another response that we share and have communicated is that while I am not actively scheduling students at our embedded spaces, students can just walk in to BNAC or La Casa or the Asian American Cultural Center and ask to meet with the confidential advisor there. They do not have to have an appointment. And so really, like, we will say and continue to say, like, this service is available to students, all students on campus. It is not restricted to students who hold a specific cultural identity. So that is my answer to that question. I think I answered that one. Okay. How I structure my model. I think I answered that question as well. But we'll just specify that our confidential advising staff are supervised by me in our Women's Resources Center. They are paid through our center. This is more of a partnership. And then, what experiences have you had working with the embedded model and community serving advocates on campus? We're exploring this, but have had little response for advocacy. We do not have community serving advocates on campus. Me and my team are legally only confidential for campus members. We will refer community members out to our community organizations. And so I would say this hasn't been my experience because we have confidential advisors on staff. We have not had to partner directly with our crisis centers in town to provide advocacy for campus. There was a period where we did have advocates from our local rape crisis center on campus when we were so short-staffed, but they were only providing services at the WRC. This was a time when our embedded model was really kind of shut down or not functioning fully because of our lack of staff availability. I think I answered all of the questions in the Q&A. I'm happy to take other questions that folks might have, knowing that I think I paced myself and I have 2 minutes left.
Absolutely amazing. Thanks everyone for joining. I put the evaluation link in the chat. Please, please, please complete it, especially if you're wanting your continuing education credits. Yeah, and thank you for being here today, everyone. Have a lovely day.
Thank you so much. Please feel free to reach out if you have questions. I really love to talk about this model. It was one of the things that really drew me to Illinois. It's a learning process at all times for me, but I do love talking about it. So
Thanks, everyone.